Hello and welcome to the first episode of Market Impacts. It's Friday, May 5th, 2023, and my name is Ben Brewer. I'm joined by my co-host, Katie Jones.
Hello, everyone.
Today we're talking about the large number of currently pending climate change lawsuits against fossil fuel companies filed by states and local municipalities across the country.
Ben, you have been doing some research into this topic. So let's start with the basics. What are these climate change lawsuits claiming?
These lawsuits are being filed all over the country, some by an entire state, others are filed by a city or local municipality. There are at least 20 cases currently pending. The claims of these lawsuits vary slightly. Some claim negligence and tort, others claim securities fraud, and some even claim public nuisance. But to put it in simpler terms, the plaintiffs allege that these companies are liable for damages caused by climate change. They argue that these companies knew about the risks of climate change, but they chose to continue to produce and sell fossil fuels anyway. Therefore, they are responsible for the harm that climate change has caused, including sea level rise, more extreme weather events, and the displacement of people.
Got it. Can you give us an example?
Sure. There is a case in Minnesota filed by the state against ExxonMobil, currently pending in the Hennepin County District Court located in Minneapolis. The state is alleging that Exxon has known for decades that burning fossil fuels causes climate change, but they have concealed this information from the public. They argue Exxon has spent millions of dollars on a, quote, campaign of deception to downplay the risks of climate change and obstruct efforts to address it. They allege that Exxon has caused the state of Minnesota to suffer significant harm from increased flooding, more extreme weather events, and damage to public health overall.
So then how is Exxon defending itself? What are they arguing?
They have filed a motion to dismiss the lawsuit, and the court has not yet ruled on that motion. They claim the state of Minnesota does not have the standing to sue, that the allegations are barred by the statute of limitations, and that they are protected by the First Amendment.
And what is the state seeking? Are they looking to get out of the lawsuit?
The state is seeking damages for the costs of addressing the impacts of climate change, as well as an injunction prohibiting the defendants from continuing to engage in the alleged deception of the public. Now, the costs of addressing the impacts of climate change are significant and are expected to increase as time goes on.
That seems like it could be interpreted in many ways. Are they asking for a specific amount of money?
No, the state hasn't set a dollar amount that they are seeking. If they win, the court will need to determine the amount of damages. That would be quite a complex and fact-intensive process.
All right. Well, let's say the state does win and the court orders Exxon to pay many millions of dollars or more in damages. Is that it?
Well, Exxon would most likely appeal that decision and try to get a different ruling. Other similar cases have already made it to the Supreme Court.
Is the court going to hear those other cases?
Actually, just last week, the Supreme Court ruled against the oil companies by turning away their appeals in 5 different cases and allowing these lawsuits to be heard in state court instead of federal court. The oil companies had argued that because greenhouse gas emissions cross state lines, the cases could not be heard in state court, only in federal court. The reason being that it would be much more difficult to win damage awards in federal court.
So what does that mean for the oil companies?
It means that the cases will be heard in state and district courts that they were filed in. It means the oil companies will have to defend themselves in state courts where the rules may be more favorable to the plaintiffs. It makes things much more difficult for the oil companies.
So this sounds like a win for all the states and local districts filing suits against these companies. They are holding these massive polluters to account for their role in worsening climate change in their communities. Sounds like a win in the fight against climate change, right?
Yes, it's definitely a win for the states and local districts filing these lawsuits. They'll have a better chance of winning damages in their state courts. And again, yes, they are holding these oil companies accountable for their role in causing climate change. But there are downsides to those large payouts that are being overlooked.
What are some of the downsides?
First, all of the cases and their potentially monumental payouts are unlikely to actually mitigate the effects of climate change at all. Just because the companies pay out huge sums does not necessarily mean that money will go towards preventing the worst effects of climate change.
Right. Just because they are fined doesn't automatically mean that those damages will be used to fight climate change effects in those communities. What else?
Another significant downside would be if oil companies are found liable and are forced to pay huge amounts of damages, they will price those costs into overall production costs. According to GMU law professor Donald Koch, it will essentially impose a tax on energy production. And when production costs increase, consumer prices increase soon after. The cost to fill up your gas tank or heat your home would increase because of these large payouts. In other words, consumers will end up paying for these damages by paying higher prices for energy overall. And if we continue this hypothetical train, higher U.S. energy prices will give other energy-producing countries an advantage in the global market. Since they are not being subjected to the massive payouts that the American energy producers are, they can undercut prices and take away U.S. market share. That could undermine U.S. national security as well.
So in the end, taxpayers would pay for it indirectly. That doesn't really hold these companies to account if all they have to do is apologize, pay a fine, and raise their prices to offset that fine. Anything else with downsiding?
Well, one of the larger reasons for these suits is to pressure oil companies to stop using fossil fuels and use renewable energy instead. In a particular case in Colorado, one of the plaintiffs explicitly stated that one of the purposes of the lawsuit is to drive up energy prices to cut into profitability and reduce consumer demand for fossil fuels. That is done by making it more difficult for average consumers to afford fossil fuels, thereby incentivizing them to seek alternative sources of energy.
Wow, they are knowingly doing this in part to raise energy prices for consumers as well?
Yes. They are overlooking the fact that the vast majority of these energy companies are currently doing research and development on more sustainable forms of energy and beginning to transition to cleaner sources of fuel. If you raise their production costs with these payouts, they will cut funding for these programs, ultimately slowing the speed of the societal transition to sustainable energy and inhibiting the necessary innovation required to make this monumental shift.
In other words, it could indirectly slow down the shift to renewable energy, the exact opposite of the intentions for filing these suits. How likely do you think these cases will be successful and force oil companies to pay damages?
Now that the cases have been allowed to be heard in state and district courts, they have a better chance than in federal court, but honestly, it's too soon to say for sure. The cases are still ongoing, and it's unclear how the courts will rule. More and more of these suits are being filed, and if one or more of them succeed, that could lead to an exponential increase in similar lawsuits by many other cities and states.
Right, and that further increases production costs and consumer prices.
Exactly. While I completely sympathize with the idea of holding fossil fuel companies accountable for their role in causing climate change acceleration, I'm not convinced that this is the best strategy for doing so. The window for preventing the worst-case scenarios of climate change is closing rapidly, and we need more cooperation not only between energy companies and the states and cities they provide to, but also between the U.S. and other countries with large amounts of emissions. This is not something the U.S. can do alone, and these cases could derail the progress that has been made thus far.
So, to summarize, while these lawsuits may sound appealing as a way of directly confronting fossil fuel companies, it may end up doing more harm than benefit by raising prices for consumers and allowing energy-rich adversaries to undercut the U.S. share of the energy market while not actually taking steps to mitigate the effects of climate change. I think we will leave it here for today. Thank you for your insight and research on this topic, Ben. This has been a very informative conversation.
Thank you, Katie, and thank you, listeners. All of the source material links are listed in the show notes for more information. This is Market Impacts, and we hope you will join us next time. Thank you.